Hello, good afternoon all, and welcome to our third Thursday Science webinar. My name is Ana Rodriguez, and I'm a Science Officer at the European Marine Board, and I will be your moderator for today. So, some housekeeping rules before we start. Please make sure your name is clearly entered, so when you ask questions, we know who you are. To ask questions during the discussion, please use the Q&A box and let us know from which organization and country you're from, and then the speaker will answer the questions verbally. For Zoom technical support, please use the chat and we will help you. And just so you're aware, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our EMB website and EMB YouTube channel. So the title of today is From Global to Regional Marine Carbon Budgets, Are We Ready to Monitor a Decarbonizing Society? This talk is linked to our upcoming document on monitoring, reporting and verification of marine carbon dioxide removal. The document will be launched soon on 17 November from 2 till 3 online. So if you're interested, please register. You see there the QR code, and my colleague will also put the link in the chat. The speaker today is Peter Landschützer. He's a research director at the Flanders Marine Institute in Belgium, and he is a member of the working group on monitoring, reporting, and verification of marine carbon dioxide removal. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. Share my slides. Good. Well, thank you very much, Anna, for the nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here and for joining me.
Peter, sorry, it's in the presenter mode. You need to swap.
All
Perfect.
Right, there we go. Now it should be okay. Good. Thanks for having me today. So the title is rather broad, from marine carbon budgets, ready to monitor a decarbonizing society. But just to give a sort of a bit of a heads up, I'm coming more from the observational side. So we'll not talk much about modeling here because this could equally be sort of a modeling focus. But I rather come from an observational background, and also. I have to say that regional carbon budgets are also something rather new to me. It's something that I haven't been thinking and working much about, but it's something that in the past years has ended up on my plate a bit more often. But as it goes, I come from sort of more the global perspective. So this is how I would like to start also this webinar today, and I would like to take you a bit back in time. I would like to take you back to the year 2013. Very special year for me. This is more or less where I can say, like, my career as a carbon cycle scientist has started with me handing in my PhD thesis. But there's another reason why I want to go back to 2013, and this is this figure that you can see on your screen, which is from a very important annual publication that comes out regularly now, that since the last 10-15 years, and that is the Global Carbon Budget. And why do I take you back to 2013? And that is because of this figure that you see here. That is sort of a very simple representation of what I would call a one-dimensional carbon budget. So the way, if we look on the global scale, how we want to look at carbon budgets. And in a very simple manner, we want to see what are the sources of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, how much carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere, and how much of that is actually then taken up again by natural sinks, which are the land sink and the ocean sink. So it's sort of a very simplification of a very complex problem, but in a sense, sort of the simplest form of how we can draw a budget. And at the time when 2013, we had quite a good knowledge of the atmospheric growth rate. I mean, it's been measured highly accurate in the atmosphere for a long time. We also have quite solid estimates of fossil fuel and cement production and emissions. And we were actually having also quite good estimates of the ocean sink, but they were predominantly based on models. And at the time, I thought, okay, I would like really to have also observations contributing to this number. And at the time, it was even more important because when you're talking about budgets, the 2013 budget was also special in the sense that it was balanced. So there were no missing sinks and sources, and the reason for it is because this other sink, the land sink, was actually calculated as the residual of the emissions minus the sinks. So just to give you a bit of an idea of the numbers, so I think it's a very broad audience, and maybe not every one of you will know what a gigaton of carbon or petagram of carbon, those are the usual units that we use in terms of the global carbon budget, how much it is or what it is. So just to give you an idea, when I talk about the ocean sink of 2.6 gigatons of carbon per year with an uncertainty of plus minus 0.5 gigatons. In 2013, this was roughly the equivalent of the emissions of China, plus minus the uncertainty of India at the time in 2013. Now time has passed, we've moved on, and the global carbon budget has become also more complex. And this is essentially the equivalent of the figure that I've just shown you from 2013, how you would find it in the latest global carbon budget that is published last year, or actually this year, which shows the global carbon cycle as a 10-year average. Now again, on the top, you see the same as that I've shown you before. You have the sources, obviously they've increased in the last 10 years. You have the atmospheric growth rate, so there's also more more CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. And then you also have the sinks, the land sink and the ocean sink. Both of them also have changed over time. But as you also see, that this is sort of, only the tip of the iceberg, and that the total picture is much more complicated than that. And in fact, then we have actually quite huge stocks of carbon dioxide. And as I'm an ocean person, I will not talk about now the reserves of fossil fuels and gas, etc. I will also not talk about the land. But if we just look at the ocean, we have this huge reservoir of dissolved inorganic carbon and organic carbon, and also a huge reservoir of carbon in the sediment. And if you sort of look at the arrows, the RC interface, you see actually there's also quite a strong natural background exchange. So even without the addition of man-made carbon dioxide, there's quite a substantial CO2 exchange. But what's really interesting about this new budget as published this year is that it's now not a residual free budget anymore. So the land is now not calculated as the residual of the emissions minus the accumulation minus the sinks, but it actually is also estimated by vegetation models. Now that leads to a new term in this global carbon budget, and it's the so-called carbon budget imbalance. Right, in a perfect system where we would know all the sources and all the sinks perfectly, this carbon budget would, this carbon imbalance would be zero. But in fact, it is not. So it's about, or last year, or it's published this year, it was about 0.4 gigatons of carbon. And again, gigatons of carbon, strange unit, just to give you an idea. So the carbon not accountable for in this last budget was about as large as the emissions of Japan. So you think you're getting a bit of the idea of my talk today is that I want to sort of challenge a bit how certain we are in terms of, when we will sort of move towards the decarbonizing society, that there's quite some uncertainties left in the carbon budget that we need to work on. And as I'm an ocean person, I would like to sort of look a bit on the ocean side, what we can do in this respect. And something that also happened in the last 10 years since this global carbon budget 2013 that I've shown you and this one published this year is that the observation community, there was a huge push, I would say, towards this value chain of ocean observations. So value chain, or as it is actually displayed more, value pyramid, consists of I would say 3 base layers that then lead to these impact layers. And the very first base layer is the observations. Now, carbon cycle or marine carbon observations have been around for a very long time, and it's very important part of this value chain, obviously, because everything that builds sort of on top is dependent on this layer below. So the observations are literally the base layer, the most important layer of this pyramid. Otherwise, this pyramid will fall apart. But what's very important also as a development over the last decades is the synthesis of these observations. So these observations were not only gathered, they were not only quality controlled, they don't only follow the highest standards. No, they've also been collected in very accessible databases. Just to name 2 of them, is the SOCAT, the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas database, or the GLODAP version 2 database. And those have this essential information of carbon now available to anyone, not only to the scientific community, but really to the public. And once you have that, once you have this collection of knowledge, you can then start, doing science on it. And then sort of, so what we do is sort of how we call it is mapping. So we started to invent something that's called the surface ocean CO2 mapping in the comparison project, where we sort of use this data to infer these CO2 fluxes, which then can go in these impact layers, which are, for example, the global carbon budget, but also IPCC reports and other United Nations frameworks. But again, when you come to the global carbon budget, there's a couple of really nice assumptions that we can make when we do this mapping. Now, what we're interested in when we look at the carbon budget on a global scale is we're looking at the fate of man-made carbon dioxide. So we actually not, or we rarely actually compare one year to the other, but we rather look at the long-term evolution. And so what we essentially can do to sort of get to the anthropogenic part of what the ocean takes up, can make this assumption that in a steady state, so before humans started to mess with the carbon cycle, is that the ocean and the atmosphere were more or less in equilibrium. So this is on a longer time scale, right? We're not talking about seasonal time scale, we're not talking about very short time scales, but on annual to interannual to decadal time scales, we can assume that the ocean and the atmosphere were in equilibrium. So essentially, there was no natural release or uptake of carbon. But what we do have is transport from land. So the ocean is also in connection with the land through rivers, etc. And what we have is actually a lateral transport of carbon of around 0.65 petagram carbons per year. So if we add this 0.65 petagram carbons per year to our net flux that we actually calculate, then we can have an estimate of the anthropogenic flux. So that is sort of a very, there's a very neat assumption that seem to hold well on a global scale. But how do we do it in practice? Now here you see this image of measurements from the SOCAT database over the last 45 years or so. And while you see that you've got quite a good coverage globally, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, you also see that you have got large gaps, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. So what we usually do is we use statistical methods like mixed layer schemes, multilinear regression, but also more advanced methods like machine learning tools to sort of learn the relationship between physical, chemical, and biological drivers that we can infer from satellite measurements. And then, take these learned relationships where we have observations and extrapolate these observations. And this is how this sort of map on the left would look like if we would apply a machine learning estimate and fill the gap. So it's a very, very interesting and very complex field, and I would be happy to talk hours about it, but I think this is going a bit beyond what we want to talk today. But once you have that, you can infer by the difference of the partial pressure between the atmosphere and the ocean, you can infer the air CO2 flux. And once you've done that, you actually get something like this, which is sort of showing you the air CO2 flux density or the exchange of carbon dioxide between the ocean and the atmosphere. So red basically means the ocean is degassing carbon dioxide, and blue means the ocean is taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And what you see here, sort of like pulsing, is sort of the seasonal cycle of this uptake. And then when you sort of really look on the equatorial Pacific, you also see variations on timescales of 3 to 5 years, which are linked to ENSO cycles, etc., etc. So essentially, yes, it can be done. Observations can be used to infer the CO2 flux. Now let's see what does it mean, what does it take, what does it bring? And this is an estimate of last year's global carbon budget as well. And this is a bit more complex. So in the beginning, I was showing you one number. This is now really a time series since the 1960s. And what you see in the darker blue colors are the estimates from ocean process models. And the thick, solid dark blue line is the mean of those models. And in turquoise colors, you see an ensemble of observation-based estimates like the ones that I've just shown you based on neural networks or other statistical methods. And again, in the thick solid in the center, the mean of them. And when we sort of first did this comparison, or in the last couple of years, when we sort of really had an ensemble of observation-based estimates and we really sort of could do this comparison with the models, we actually realized that something is not quite all right, because you see that there's a divergence between them. So in black, what you see in the center would be sort of the mean of those two estimates. But if you just look at the difference, particularly in the year 2020 or in the year 2019, even though we actually have quite a good observational coverage compared to other years, so that's what you see in the bottom bar graph, you see quite a substantial divergence. And this divergence, again, you see CO2 flux in gigaton carbon strange unit. This red arrow is about as large as the emissions of the EU 27 together. Now, this is a substantial amount. And in order to understand, so in order to close a carbon budget, to have a residual free carbon budget, or in order to monitor smaller changes, we need to sort out these differences. And just as a consequence, what does the global carbon budget state? This is not from the last one, it's actually from a couple of years back. There's a statement that we refrain from assigning a high confidence because of the systematic deviation between the global ocean budget chemical models and data product trends since around 2002. So even on a global scale, where we actually have quite good knowledge, we still face some challenges in the global carbon budget. And if you then even include other estimates, it gets even more clear that we're dealing with quite some uncertainty. So this is also a plot from the global carbon budget. But here, this is sort of illustrates both the ocean sink on the y-axis and on the x-axis the land sink. And next to the models and the products that are based on measurements that I've already mentioned, you also now see atmospheric inverse estimates. Now, this dashed line would be this essentially one-on-one line. So if you want to have a balanced budget, you want to be on this dashed line because only when sort of the lower ocean sink basically is compensated by a higher land sink, you have a balanced budget. And you see that the GCP, as I've shown you, is not quite on this dashed line, but with uncertainties overlapping. But you also see that there is quite a spread, not only in the different estimates in the ocean, but also on land, also in the atmospheric inversions. And then we have an independent estimate that is based on actually atmospheric oxygen measurements, which also sees quite a spread there as well. So this is just to illustrate you, where the uncertainties lie even on a global scale. But as I said, I'm not going to talk much about models today, so I'm not going to sort out the model issues that might exist there. But I was very curious to understand where the issues from the data products come, because just if you take this FCO2 products, as you see on the in turquoise again on the x-axis, you see also a spread of 1 gigaton of carbon, or again, in other units, a bit more than the emissions of the United States. So you want to understand where this spread comes from and where it could potentially come from. So we go back to the observations, and what we do is we fill the data gap. So maybe there the issue comes from. And this is the same map I've shown you before, plus an additional one at the bottom, who shows that that the data sparsity is not only something that is has a spatial extent, but it also has a temporal extent. So particularly in the southern hemisphere, you not only have data gaps, you also have very few regions where you have observations collected in more than a single or 2 months of the year. So that is quite problematic. And so what we did is we did some experiments, some idealized experiments, where we sort of tried to reconstruct the known truth, in this case, like an ensemble of many models, to just see, if we use the sampling as we have in real life, would we actually be able to reconstruct the known truth model? And we figured out that especially on longer timescales, like decadal timescales, where these trends do matter, and in the Southern Ocean, where we actually have very few data, we see errors up to 100%. So this is really huge errors that we're facing due to data limitation, even at the global scale. And we even spun it further and said, okay, what if we would just add a new one single observation line, and this is this black line, in the Southern Ocean. It's actually a real line. It's actually measurements that really happened from a sailboat. And we did the test. Okay, well, what if we estimate the air CO2 flux if we add this one sailboat measurement, and if we don't? And what you see is quite a significant difference in the Southern Ocean. Again, teragram carbon, what does that mean? Is about 1/4 of all the coastal CO2 uptake of the globe. And this is just by adding one sailboat in the Southern Ocean. And this is quite substantial uncertainties. And but you might also say, like, okay, now this is one method, just sort it out, just remove it from the ensemble of this GCP, this GCP ensemble, because by now you've got 9 different ones. It's just one bad method. Well, we did this experiment where we subsampled so I tried to reconstruct the models with all of them, or maybe almost all of them, actually. Not everyone could contribute, but with most of them. So the majority of the methods were there. And then we also thought it further. We said, like, okay, maybe the problem is also the subsampling model that we use, right? It might be that we just use a sort of a poorly constrained model that we are just not in no way able to reconstruct. So we use 5 different ones. But what we see is the same story. If you just take an individual method, you might be quite far off. You might find quite a large divergence compared to the model truth. Now, this is at global scale, but it's the same on regional scale, but particularly in the Southern Ocean. But what we also found, and this is something that was a bit encouraging for the global carbon budget, is also these black markers in the center. That actually, if you take the ensemble, you actually average out errors. That actually this ensemble approach might not be so bad, and that actually that errors that you have in individual products indeed cancel each other out. So this is now the first part of what I wanted to tell you about. And to just summarize it, so human activities have altered the pre-industrial carbon cycle. We know that. That is essentially why we started doing global carbon budgets in the first place, to understand how the carbon cycle is changing also in industrial times. We also find that observation-based and model constraints provide a window into this change, so we actually can understand a bit more, the rate of change and the trends. But that also highlights that we've got still significant discrepancies that exist about the ocean carbon sink. And there's also this discrepancy also between the models and observations that we have not fully grasped yet. But we can definitely say that the data sparsity, or not full observational coverage, is definitely part of this problem. And this is essentially, for me, as a person that comes more from the observational side, a very important conclusion that we should not despite all the technical advantages that we now have with machine learning, with modeling, that we should not forget that the base layer of the pyramid are the observations. And this is indeed also challenging now our ability to close the global carbon budget. So there are still uncertainties, unknowns, like this global carbon budget imbalance, or this divergence between models and the observation-based estimates. So now comes the part where I'm feeling a bit more uncomfortable as well. So that's good. Let's start. Why would we go regional now? Since we still have the global carbon budget, it gives us an idea about our climate. But why do we now sort of see this sort of interest in more regional carbon budget, or do things at regional scale? And the reason for it, in my opinion, is that it's a scale where human activities, climate interventions, etc., influence the carbon cycle. And it's also a scale that becomes relevant for carbon reporting. So now, as we move to this decarbonized society, actually we have defined goals on a national level, with defined on a union level. And in order to monitor those, there's sort of this push towards sort of looking at sort of the regional scale. So we have, for example, country scale carbon budgets, and etc. But also very important, and this is why I mentioned climate interventions, is also carbon dioxide removal, which is now becoming more and more prominent in the carbon cycle world. There's more and more interest in also removing extra carbon dioxide, and also for at least test trials, so where we are still at a small scale, these regional budgets matter quite a lot. Now, I've tried a couple of years back, tried to sort of draw a similar picture, like this very simple global carbon budget that I've showed you very much in the beginning, with a slightly different twist, but for how such a regional carbon budget could look like. And now, if you sort of just imagine any shelf sea that you like, this could be your regional carbon budget, simple illustration of that. So we have the shelf sea, we have the atmosphere on top of it, we have the air-CO2 exchange, driven by the partial pressure difference still of the sea surface and the atmosphere. But we also have this large stock of inorganic carbon. We have got a large stock of organic carbon, which sort of draws down the sea surface partial pressure of CO2 by biological uptake. In shelf sea, very important process is sedimentation and re-release. But compared to this sort of very sort of simple one-dimensional global carbon budget, there's now a couple of I would say like challenges there that that you can immediately see in this drawing. And those are the arrows to the left, physical transport of carbon, and then to the right, the river transport of carbon, plus that sort of boat in this case representing a trawler. But you can also, if you like, if you like, rather would like to imagine seagrass meadow, that is perfectly fine. Or if you would like to imagine a dredging vessel, a windpark being built, you name it, or a marine carbon dioxide removal technique being deployed. You can be, you imagine it yourself. But they show the challenges of it. And let me go back to this one, nice assumption figure that I've shown you before. And you might have back then asked yourself, why is he showing that? Because now I can go back to it. Because this really nice assumption that we have at the global scale, when you do the global carbon budgets, they don't apply anymore to the regional ones. So for the global carbon budget, we assumed that the natural carbon cycle was balanced. So when you sort of integrate over the entire globe in pre-industrial times, over time scales long enough, we have zero exchange because we're in equilibrium. And we also have sort of a global number of this lateral transport. Now, these nice assumptions don't apply anymore to our regional carbon budgets. In fact, we don't know anymore, or for most regions, we don't know whether our natural region was a carbon source or a carbon sink. Models might be able to tell us that, but based on measurements, we're not able to tell it. Because for that, we would have had to measure carbon dioxide in the seawater 150, 200 years ago. And this is a challenge. And so this brings me to my sort of first question that I would like sort of to pose here as the biggest challenge that I see in regional carbon budgets is, what is the baseline regionally, and how on which we can actually calculate additionality? On what can we base additionality? And again, additionality of either human impacts, for example, bottom trawling, or of carbon dioxide removal technique, say, for example, ocean alkalinization, for example. And for that, I have a very good reading suggestion for you, which is a paper called Unaccountable Accounting, the Folly of Incorporating Open Ocean Carbon Sinks in Nationally Determined Contributions by Berger, Comte, Kwiatkowski, and Bob. So just, look it up. I can highly recommend you reading this one. This goes much deeper into this problem of additionality and baseline. But there's also a second challenge. So you might say, like, okay, fair enough, your regional carbon budget, you now done all this effort to get these global estimates of the CO2 fluxes. Can't you just use those? Well, I thought about that as well, and now I'm sort of focusing in to the southern right of the North Sea, and actually this red box, mainly the region where I'm currently most active in, and that is the Belgian part of the North Sea. And this is sort of how this region would look like on our, what we would call a global scale high resolution grid, so 25-kilometer grid. So essentially, there's not so much left of the Belgian part of the North Sea. And when that compared it to interpolation of direct data, so this is a map that a colleague of mine, Thanos Gritsalis, gave me one day. And so we were comparing really the same month here from two different sources. So one from one of these global ocean methods, neural network methods, and one that is really like based on cruise data directly interpolated. And you see that the difference is literally an order of magnitude. And you see like spatial structures that you can never ever resolve on this 25-kilometer grid scale. So you see the problem is not only the problem of the missing background, the missing assumptions that you can just take, oh, before we deploy our CDR technique, we were balanced. No, you don't. And the same is with the problem of scales, right? You have sort of processes acting on very, very small and very small spatial scales and very short time scales. So the question now that you can also pose for this regional budget is, do we actually resolve these required scales that we need? And it is posed as a question, and I believe at the moment, no, we don't. but we can at least start, because we know we're moving to this world either way. So we might as well start now, knowing that we have these shortcomings of not knowing the background and the scales. So my priority number one that I would like you to take home maybe with you is that data collection is the most essential part, and infrastructure strengthening. Now, this is one example, again, from the southern right of the North Sea, where you see sort of measurements largely through the ICOS, the Integrated Carbon Observing System, infrastructure, but also others. So I don't want to sort of single ICOS out, but just want to mention it as well as one of the very important infrastructure that we have at the European levels to secure the continuation of carbon dioxide measurement at the spatial and temporal scales that we need. And don't forget the pyramid structure, right? If we don't have the bottom layer of the pyramid, everything that we build on top is not going to work. So we really need that. So this is really my number one priority. And as we move towards these regional budgets, we really have to, think about what are the spatial scales and what are the temporal scales we need. And they might be very different than what we find in the open ocean for the classic carbon budgets, where we really think like, annual means 100 by 100 kilometers. They will probably not be good enough for our highly variable coastal ocean budgets. Secondly, is also now the processes that we require to understand the variability at scales. And this is sort of a very interesting example from one of my PhD students, from Andrea van Langenbosson, who was looking actually at the carbon budget of the North Sea, but she was also looking at high frequency variability in these orange regions that you see here on the top left. Not going into detail why this orange region, it's based on a biome analysis. But what's really interesting is that she found that sort of winter storms sort of a very, very strong relationship with the variability of particulate organic carbon. And if you sort of look at this time series at the top in this sort of gray bar, and then look at the plot at the bottom, which sort of represents this gray bar, you see that this is at very, very sort of short temporal scales. These wind speed events, or these high wind speed events, sort of drive really like a massive increase in this particular organic carbon content. So these are the processes that we need to resolve, and we need to resolve them at the scale as they happen, if we really want to close, or if we really want to ever get close to balancing a regional carbon budget, and to be able to prove additionality of human activities. We also have to adapt, obviously, the way how we sort of interpolate the observations, because we even in the ideal case that we get all the funding, all the infrastructures available to do the measurements that we need, there will always be gaps. So we'll not be able to measure carbon dioxide at the surface, at depth, at the resolution that we need. So we also have to rethink how we're going to use sort of on the one hand additional auxiliary information like satellites, but also how we adapt our statistical techniques like the machine learning techniques. And what you see here is, again, for the Belgian part of the North Sea, an example from another PhD student of mine, Marie Keppens, who's sort of tried to map the sea surface partial pressure of CO2 at the 1 kilometer daily resolution, sort of to get a bit closer, to understand what the background is. As I said, we cannot get back in time and not be able to tell what happened in 1850. But at least what we can do is we can have now a time series of 20 years and then say, like, okay, this is the background where we now start off. And from this moment on, we can at least have a look and what we would expect in terms of carbon dioxide. So now, summarizing also the regional scale, I would say that monitoring human activities or climate event interventions, they're becoming more important, particularly in the decarbonizing society. So we're not, we eventually will, carbon cycle scientists, I believe, marine carbon cycle scientists will eventually come across these questions of, can we actually monitor these human activities, climate interventions, etc. And a global approach that worked pretty well, incomplete, not ideal, but they work quite well on a global scale. But I'm very convinced they do not cover the required scales at the regional level. And we really have to think into the future now how we're going to tackle this problem. And additionality will be impossible to quantify without setting a background or baseline. So we need to know what would have happened without the human intervention to be able to say, like, okay, this was then the effect of the human intervention. So we need to strengthen in the first place the observational capacities to eliminate these blind spots, so we can actually say how that we can quantify additionality. And even if we never get there with observations, we still need them to support modeling efforts, because those are at the moment the ones we have to rely on the regional scale at this high resolution. And I'm reaching my 30 minutes, so all I have left to say is a final quote that comes from the same paper that I've mentioned earlier by Berger, Comte, Kwiatkowski, and Bob. And I could not agree more with it. And in principle, I could have just put this one sentence up for you, and this is sort of the core message of my talk today, is to identify the additionality of management measures, robust assessments of the baseline carbon sink and how it would have evolved without intervention will be needed. And this is complicated, but especially in temporally dynamic nature of ocean carbon fluxes. And more fundamentally, there is no co-localization between air-sea fluxes and the subsequent sequestration of carbon in the ocean due to circulation and mixing. And this is really what we have to be working on if we really want to quantify it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was really, really interesting. I appreciate how even someone like me who's not an expert could really follow your presentation. So that was really interesting.
Thank you very much. That was the idea, that it's for the broader audience.
Yes, yes. So if for the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A. I see there's already one question. Let me open it. Okay, so Fernanda, my colleague, asks, coming from someone that is not an expert on the global carbon cycle, how resilient is this cycle to ongoing climate change? Will things continue to operate effectively under higher or more extreme temperatures and CO2 levels?
Yes, so that is a very good question. So what we already see is that the evolution of the sources and sinks is also obviously depending on climate change and various other factors. So I'm not going to go too much into land because this is really not my area of expertise. But we know, for example, that due to changes in temperature, we see, for example, just to give you one example, we last year, no, sorry, in 2023, saw already a decline in the carbon sink, in the expected carbon uptake by the ocean due to the marine heat waves. But also on the longer term, you see not only the warming that affects the ocean carbon uptake, but also the change in buffer capacity. So what you do is by taking up more carbon dioxide, trying to break it down for the wider audience. So if you take more carbon dioxide, what you do change is the carbonate chemistry. So you shift the pH and you shift the capacity, the buffer capacity, also the amount of carbon dioxide that the ocean can still absorb. So this will sort of slowly decline as we progress with as the ocean progresses, taking up more carbon dioxide. So the sinks will eventually weaken.
Okay, great. And maybe a question from me linked to that. So you said that also from a non-expert, so globally it's in balance, the carbon intake and in-gassing and out-gassing, is that correct?
No, it is not. So
Okay.
It used to be. So I mean, if you sort of think of it very simple, so you've got fossil fuel emissions and land use emissions. So basically they increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But when you measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you only have about half of the emissions that remain in the atmosphere. So the other half goes into the land, into the ocean. And what happened, like in 2013, in this very first budget, is that the ocean carbon sink was calculated from ocean models, and then sort of there was the land carbon sink was then calculated as the residual, so as the remainder. So whatever was not an emission, whatever didn't stay in the atmosphere, whatever was not taken up by the ocean went into the land. And then it's balanced, because then you don't have any leftovers. But this has changed because we now have got a much better representation also of carbon fluxes on land by vegetation models. So they are now included also in the global carbon budget. But now we don't have this sort of nice closure anymore, because we have estimates of fossil fuel emissions and land use change that are independent, atmospheric growth rates that are independent, the ocean sink is independent, and the land sink is independent. And if you now add those all up, you're not exactly balanced anymore. So you have this budget imbalance, or this residual term that I've mentioned, this 0.4 petagrams of carbon, or about the emissions of Japan.
Okay, but that's an imbalancement just in our measurements, or an actual imbalancement in nature? Is it that our measurements are not correct, or is it that there is not a balance in nature?
You could say this is a leftover that we cannot explain. It could be a problem on the land. It could be that the land models underestimate the uptake, for example. It could be that the ocean is underestimating. It could be both. It could be that the ocean is, 2 gigatons off, and the land is 3.5 gigatons, or 2.5 gigatons off. It's very unlikely that it's the latter case. But essentially, it's the amount of carbon that we cannot essentially explain.
Okay. Okay, great. And while I wait to see if anyone else has any questions, Fernanda says thank you for the explanation, by the way. I have a very more fundamental overview question. So do you think we'll ever be able to use, to measure additionality accurately enough to, for example, include them in the nationally determined contributions?
This is a very difficult one, and the problem, I really recommend you also reading this paper by Berger et al., because this really gives a very good case. So they're looking actually at the French exclusive economic zone in this respect. And the problem is really the transport, because the problem really fundamentally is that you don't know what is the baseline. You don't know the baseline. And the second thing is, you might take up carbon dioxide in your exclusive economic zone, and then it's transported with the current couple of 100, maybe 1,000 kilometers away, and then it degasses again. So it's a question also of, how do you account for that, right? Can you actually count the net, sort of the exclusive economic zone in your national contribution? Should all marine waters just be one pool essentially, which makes, in my view, a bit more sense. I think this is the challenge.
Yeah, that's a good point. It sounds like we're far away from it, unless we agree, like you say, to somehow put it as one pool, which would make things complicated.
I think it is definitely something where we all have to have the same. So it's not something that every country can solve by its own. That is definitely the case.
Yeah.
I can imagine that if you sort of look at all the exclusive economic zones together, that you find an approach that is sort of a unified approach between all of them, also then accounting for transport out of this exclusive economic zone as good as you can estimate it. You might find a solution there.
Yeah. Okay. So there's another question from Fernanda. She says, on that note, your answer before, to help balance the budget, what does it mean that winter storms with high wind speed are correlating so strongly with particulated organic carbon?
We haven't really fully closed that story yet, but what we know is obviously that, what we know is that through the winter storms, this is a shelf sea region we're talking about now. What we have is a lot of free suspension of sedimented particles, and this is where this POC comes from. And what we also found, and I haven't shown it now, but this also sort of increases the partial pressure of carbon dioxide now. Now we haven't really fully made sort of the full link on, sort of storms, release of particular organic matter, and how it then increases the PCO2 exactly. We're still sort of working on that link, but essentially it's resuspension of sedimented material back into the water column, and that releases carbon dioxide again, one way or the other, which we're still trying to quantify how.
Okay, great. It also reminds me that I found really interesting what you said, that the individual models have a lot of uncertainty, but if you use the ensemble ones, the uncertainty goes down. So I think that shows how important it is to not just have one method, but to combine many methods.
Yes, I think this was one of our surprising results, actually, of a study. Actually, one of my group members, Alice Robert, is working on. So in my opinion, what I thought after having done this first study where I showed that the trends were, especially in the Southern Ocean, quite wrong. Yes, 100% wrong because of the data sparsity. my opinion was that this must be true for all of them, because they all use the same data as inputs, right? They all models, as different they are in how they treat the data, they all get the same data as input. And so it was actually quite surprising for me that actually there's that there's a sort of a balancing effect between those who overestimate the trend and underestimate the trend. And we, in the global carbon budget, actually we use this knowledge and we spun it a bit further. You can actually draw an emergent constraint out of it, because if you sort of take the sort of the bias that these individual methods create, sort of compared to the model truth, and then plot this one against the linear trend that they have in the global carbon budget, you actually see that the models with the highest trends have positive bias. The models with the lowest trends in the global carbon budget have a negative bias. And if you sort of take then, draw an artificial zero bias line, you actually get a trend of about 0.45 and 0.5 gigatons carbon a year per decade. Sorry, don't quote my units right now. But the point is sort of that agrees actually quite well with an independent estimate that we now recently have from Nicolas Maillot. So that's actually quite encouraging that we can use this information also as an emergent constraint.
Indeed, that's really encouraging. Another question I have, unless anyone from the participants has a question, please put it in the chat. So, well, your talk showed how many gaps we still have, particularly in the Southern Ocean, but you also mentioned temporally. So if we would have to prioritize more observations and infrastructure strengthening, is there any place where we should obviously prioritize it? Maybe the Southern Ocean, if the resources will be limited, where should we put the priority?
Yeah, I think the Southern Ocean is on a global scale where we should do this. I mean, the reason is that just the size of the Southern Ocean plus its absorption capacity. So the Southern Ocean absorbs a huge amount of the marine carbon dioxide, and it is just because of its size so important. But it's also challenging because not only is it when we sort of compare ocean mass to land mass, it's sort of remote to a lot of countries, but it's also challenging to observe with sea ice, the Arctic close to the Antarctic continent, and also with storms with the Antarctic circumpolar current. So it's a very difficult environment to observe, and you have research vessels going there, but they're not measuring at the moment at the frequency that we need the data. So there's a couple of cool projects out there that try to overcome it. So I've mentioned already sailboats. So there's one project, a European Horizon Europe project called Tracuso, which now tries to deploy sensors on sailboats and other platforms in the Southern Ocean, so to increase, to just make use of all the platforms that are already there and make them all measure carbon dioxide. A bit like what we have in the Northern Hemisphere, we can, where we've used cargo vessels for a very long time already to take measurements. And the second one is one from a colleague of the United States of America. There are two colleagues that has just been funded by the Schmidt Foundation, which is called COCO2 or CO2. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but that one is it's got a 5 year time frame to deploy sail drones, so unmanned surface vehicles. So they've shown in the past that they can be used also to take winter observations. So really the month where we have very few observations. And I think this is those two projects are a very strong step forward, because they really will do what I mentioned so much in my talk. They will sort of strengthen this base layer, this observing layer. And once we have that, then we can sort of build things on top. But we first have to have this base layer.
That sounds very, very good ideas and innovative. And the first one with the sailboats, I suppose that counts as citizen science, right? So it's citizens, or is it scientists? What kind of people are doing that?
Oh, it's actually indeed citizen scientists. So there's a couple of around the world racing events taking place that some of you may know. I mean, there's, for example, a race called the Vendée Globe, and another one is called the Ocean Race. So you've got these actually are real sport events, like with lots of sport enthusiasts following them. And the idea is really to sail across the globe. I mean, they start for the Vendée Globe, for example, in France in one day, and then they go down the South Atlantic, circumnavigate Antarctica, and then go up again the Atlantic. And while doing that, why not taking measurements? And we have started that program in 2018 with a German skipper, Boris Herrmann, who has now, for the Vendée Globe and the Ocean Race, collected CO2 measurements using a membrane sensor. Now they're not scientists, as you say, like Red, so they are not, they will not, and the sailboat is not a research vessel, so they will never be able to replace, high quality research vessel measurements. But what they definitely can do is sort of provide, measurements in blind spots, even if they don't have the highest quality, but they will actually close the blind spots, at least for us. And we've shown that this is possible, and it's sort of quite exciting to work with them.
Yeah, that's really cool. Another question I had is, you showed that there's this increasing divergence in the estimated CO2 flux, despite that we have more observations in the latter years. Do you know why this is?
This is a very good question. Now, this is a good question. I mean, on the one hand, more observation doesn't necessarily mean you have the observation in the right place, right? I mean, if all the divergence would come, and it's actually a lot of the divergence comes from the Southern Ocean, and there we actually have experienced a decline in one of a very important time series, like the Drake Passage time series. If I'm not mistaken, I think the Drake Passage time series has stopped in the year 2000, for example. So we have, it's not only the question of the overall measurements, but also where they measured. So I think it would require more detailed analysis. Where we have the blind spots, where do we have the biggest divergence? I mean, it is the Southern Ocean where we have the biggest divergence, I know that. But to see the evolution exactly there where we have the biggest divergence.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any questions from participants. So my last question is, so the first slide showed the global CO2 budget per year, and then you showed another budget that was much more elaborate, but I don't remember the numbers. Has it really changed from, I think it was 2014 to now, these global carbon budgets? Because I understand it's a yearly influx to the atmosphere, right?
It's actually, both of them were decadal averages. So they're basically from the decade before. So the one from 2013 was the average from 2004 to 2013. And the last one was the average from 2015 to 2024. But what you see is obviously emissions go up. That's something we know. Emissions have increased. We also know that CO2 in the atmosphere has increased. But we also see that the sinks have increased. So the ocean and the atmosphere sink. I mean, there's obviously, especially in the annual time scales, like the land shows quite some strong variations. The ocean shows on an internal to decadal time scale some variation. But overall, the trend is that sources and sinks are increasing.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. Thanks a lot. So I only have one more slide to share about the webinar next week. Let me know if you see my screen in a second. Is it in full screen? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So next month, our webinar will be on deep pelagic biology, biodiversity, and carbon flux. It will be on Thursday, 20 November, and the speaker will be Henk Jan Hoving. He leads the working group Deep Sea Biology at Geomar in Germany and was also a member of EMB's working group on deep sea research and management needs, our future science brief, which was launched in April this year. So if you're interested, please sign up. And I think my colleague Fernanda will put the link in the chat. And then I'm just left with thanking you again, Peter, and all of you for being here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.